Today we will be comparing uniforms from the late Victorian period to the First World War of light infantry and rifle units, using uniforms from two of Halifax's own regiments, the 63rd Regiment Halifax Rifles and the 66th Regiment Princess Louise Fusiliers. Both of these regiments can trace their lineage back to the earliest Nova Scotia militia units in Halifax in the mid-18th century. Post-Confederation, they were officially authorized by the Dominion of Canada in 1867 and 1869 respectively. The Halifax Rifles was one of 6 volunteer rifle companies formed in December of 1859. In 1860, this company and the others would form the Halifax Volunteer Battalion. Post-Canadian Confederation, the Halifax Rifles were authorized as a Canadian militia unit later in 1867. The Halifax Rifles' motto is Sic Nullis, which is Latin for yield to none. They have an honorary distinction for the War of 1812 and battle honors for the Northwest Rebellion, the South African War, also known as the First Boer War, various battles in World War I and World War II. They were the only Nova Scotia unit to have unbroken organization and service from before the Confederation of Canada until 1965, when they were placed on the Supplementary Order of Battle. They are also the first and currently only regiment reactivated after being placed on the Supplementary Order of Battle. They are active today as an armor regiment in the Royal Canadian Armoured Corps. These uniforms are nothing like the red coats we associate with the British and later Canadian military tradition. This is because rifle regiments, by nature, are meant to be inconspicuous. This type of unit originated in 1755 when the British in the American colonies were failing miserably in confrontations with the French and their indigenous allies. Between bright red coats, formal tactics, and unconventional terrain like dense forests, they tried to gain an advantage by creating a darker and less cumbersome uniform and simplifying their drills, equipping these regiments for fast movement. This is the Halifax Volunteer Rifles tunic, an earlier iteration of the Halifax Rifles from the mid to late Victorian era. This tunic is pretty faded, as is the scarlet piping. Tunics for rifle regiments were meant to be a dark rifle green, but this one could just as easily be faded black. The red facings are also quite faded. The term facings refers to the color on the cuffs and collar of a uniform which differed from the color of the rest of the piece. This was a European military tradition used to help distinguish regiments from each other. This particular tunic belonged to a rank-and-file or other rank soldier, so it's not the highest quality. Soldiers of the militia had to pay for their own uniforms, so using lower quality materials helped keep the cost down for non-commissioned soldiers' uniforms. Other ranks' uniforms would have been made in large quantities in set, standard sizes and were to be left unaltered, whereas officers' uniforms were better made and were tailored to fit the individuals wearing them. This being an other ranks tunic, it's a simple design and there are no tailor's labels on the inside. The epaulets or shoulder straps are also quite plain. Higher ranks, in addition to better quality uniforms, would have had some decoration on them to denote rank. This officer's tunic is from the late Victorian era, probably closer to 1901 when Queen Victoria died. This tunic also features this black leather crossbelt, but let's first look at the tunic. These netted buttons on the shoulder cords are consistent with the 1894 dress regulations for rifle regiment officers' tunics. These 3 rank stars or pips on the shoulder cords indicates that this was a captain's uniform, but unfortunately there is no tailor's tag, name tag, or even initials to be found on this tunic. You can sort of see the difference in fabric compared to the last tunic. It's finer and is softer to the touch. This tunic also has the red facings on the sleeves and collar, though they are different and brighter than those on the previous one. This tunic has a lot more detail and decoration, consistent with the 1894 dress regulations, such as these netted caps and drops, and these 5 loops of black cord which fasten with these black olivets. This one also has interior hook and eye closure, as you can see here. The back of the tunic, also consistent with the 1894 dress regulations, also has the black square cord on each back seam, which doubles after passing under these black netted caps at the waist. These black cord decorations at the bottom of the skirt are called Austrian knots. The Austrian knot, which originated in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, quickly became a status symbol for the nobility there and was also used to indicate rank for the hussars in the army. It's one of the many style elements that the British borrowed for their own military, which Canada adopted in turn. This tunic also has an Austrian knot on each sleeve made of black mohair braid and traced with black Russian braid. Mohair, a material made from Angora goat's hair, was quickly becoming a popular material for the upper class at the time. Mohair is almost silk-like and is comparable to cashmere in expense, but it is also very resilient, making it a good choice for a military uniform. Crossbelts such as this one were made of black goatskin leather. It features several silver ornaments, all a regimental pattern. This lion's head on the left breast with the attached chains and whistle, this 63rd Halifax Rifles badge in the middle, and this whistle case below the right breast. The crossbelt was meant to support a pouch worn centered on the back like this one. These pouches were also made of goatskin leather and were meant to carry field glasses or binoculars according to the 1896 dress regulations. Other ranks would have worn a rifle cartridge pouch instead of a field glasses pouch, as they carried rifles while officers carried swords. This is a patrol jacket, also from the late Victorian period. Patrol jackets were part of the undress uniform, which was less fancy than service dress and cut slightly different, but still similar in look. These 4 black and red chevrons on the right sleeve, with a pip or rank star just above them, indicate that this is the jacket of a quartermaster sergeant. This was a non-commissioned or other rank, and they handled the supplies in stores. This jacket has a tailor's label sewn inside the collar, which reads W.F. Pickering, Halifax, NS. Also known as W.F. Pickering & Company, this was a merchant tailor shop on Barrington Street established around 1890. It is interesting that this jacket has a tailor's label in it, as it is an other ranks piece, but it may be that this quartermaster sergeant had this jacket tailor-made for himself, as some higher other ranks may have done. This jacket has similar red facings to the previous one, and the same style of decorative cording down the front, with black cord loops and olivets, and netted caps and drops. There is some black decoration on the sleeve, lined with black Russian braid, but it is less ornate than the black mohair Austrian braid on the previous tunic. This jacket has interior hook and eye closure, like the tunic we just looked at and the one we'll see next. The back of this jacket is different from the previous tunic, again less fancy. The coverings over the back seams and decoration along the bottom and seam coverings were standard for rifle regiment patrol jackets of the time, but this decoration here seems to have been a creative liberty taken by the soldier who wore this jacket. Though it was not common to add unauthorized decorations to uniforms, it was not unheard of, especially if this jacket was specially made for this soldier, as this and the tailor's label may suggest. This is a second lieutenant's uniform, likely post-1907, as this tunic is a stellar example of the 1907 dress regulations for officers of the Canadian militia. Though the more phonetic American pronunciation for this word is lieutenant, the Canadian Armed Forces still officially uses the British pronunciation of lieutenant. The 1907 dress regulations stipulated the following: rifle green cloth edged all round except the collar with black square cord, scarlet cloth collar and cuffs, the collar edged with 1-inch black braid with a tracing of braid below, the cuffs pointed and Austrian knot on the sleeve, with a tracing of plain braid round it, extending to 8.5 inches from the bottom of the cuff. The skirt rounded off in front, closed behind, and lined with black. On each side of the breast, 5 loops of black square cord with netted caps and drops, fastening with black olivets. Like the last 2 pieces, this tunic also features interior hook and eye closure. The 1907 dress regulations also stipulate shoulder cords of black chain gimp with a small button of regimental pattern at the top. Unfortunately, those buttons are missing from this tunic. There is, however, a single pip or rank star on each shoulder cord, indicative of the second lieutenant rank. The back of this tunic, very similar to the Victorian-era officer's tunic we already looked at, is also consistent with the 1907 dress regulations, which stipulates, on each back seam a line of the same cord forming a crow's foot at the top, passing under a netted cap at the waist, below which it is doubled, and ending in an Austrian knot reaching to the bottom of the skirt. This tunic also features a busby cord. The busby was a type of cap that the Canadian Army adopted from the British. The busby cord would attach the busby cap to the tunic so that the cap would not completely fall off and get lost if it were to come off the soldier's head. What's interesting and frustrating about this tunic is there's a tag in the collar that used to have the officer's name written on it, but it is now too worn out to read. The tailor's name is printed at the top of the tag, and it appears to be P.W. Flight Winchester. The name of the soldier, handwritten below, is mostly illegible, but the parts we can make out looks like M.E.M. illegible ESQ, which is an abbreviation of Esquire. Unfortunately, with no precise date known for this tunic and so much of the name illegible, it is unlikely that the identity of the soldier who wore this uniform can be recovered. This tunic has an accompanying pair of uniform pants. These pants are black with a 2-inch dark rifle green stripe down the leg and have a button fly. Interestingly, the same 1907 dress regulations that the tunic fits so well states that the pants for rifle regiments were to be rifle green with a black stripe down the leg. Unfortunately, we do not have another Halifax Rifles uniform with pants from the same time period, so we can't say whether inconsistency with the 1907 dress regulations was regiment-wide or specific to this uniform. This tunic is a 63rd Halifax Rifles band tunic from World War I. It is an other ranks tunic made of wool, and these would have been made in vast quantities to dress all the soldiers in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Khaki was a much more suitable color for 20th century warfare, helping soldiers to blend in with their muddy surroundings. Khaki was also a smarter color choice due to new technology such as airplanes, making it harder for troops to be spotted by air. Interestingly, the British Army actually switched to khaki uniforms for active service during the First Boer War in 1880 to 1881 to help their forces blend in better with their desert surroundings. Though these khaki uniforms would all look the same from a distance, each regiment had its own unique badges, pins, and sometimes buttons that helped identify them. For example, this tunic has 2 metal 63rd Halifax Rifles bugle badges on each side of the stand-up collar, and brass 63 and band badges on the shoulder straps. The tunics themselves were kept as basic as possible to keep the cost, material, and production time to a minimum without sacrificing their functionality. The Halifax Rifles were stationed here in Halifax during World War I to protect this essential port city. Some soldiers from this regiment served overseas but were only able to do so if they could find someone to take their place on garrison duty in Halifax. This is how the Halifax Rifles have battle honors for several battles on the Western European front, including the battles of the Somme and Mount Sorel in 1916, Amiens and Hill 70 in 1917, Arras from 1917 to 1918, and the Pursuit to Mons in 1918.
The Princess Louise Fusiliers get their name from Princess Louise, the 6th child of Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Consort Albert. In 1879, Princess Louise consented to the 66th Regiment bearing her name as its colonel-in-chief. Fun fact, the province of Alberta also takes its name from Princess Louise, one of whose many middle names is Alberta. The regiment's motto is Fideliter, which is Latin for faithfully. They have battle honors for various battles in the Northwest Rebellion, the South African War, also known as the Boer War, the First World War, and the Second World War. They are still active in Halifax today. This first piece is part of the effects of Colonel D.S. Bald, who served with the Princess Louise Fusiliers before, during, and after the First World War. The flashy scarlet color of the uniform is for two separate reasons. The first, visibility. Red is easier to see through fog and smoke and help prevent friendly fire. Red also helped hide bloodstains, whether they were the enemy's or their own. According to 1907 dress regulations, Fusilier uniforms were the same as infantry with a few exceptions, namely the cap, plume, and helmet. Unfortunately, we don't have any examples of those pieces to go along with this piece. This tunic is from before 1903, which we can tell from the lacing here at the cuff. These patterns were introduced in 1886, and this one here is a captain's rank. It's very hard to see the patterns of lace on the cuff, but according to dress regulations, it had to have a gold maple leaf pattern. You can tell by the lack of extra embellishment along the chevrons here that this is a captain's rank. How we know it's from before 1903 is because all officers were ordered to use the lacing previously used by lieutenants, which was one chevron less. You can see the Austrian knot here at the top as well, and this gold edging is called bullion and is a common piece on these uniforms. You can also see the brass buttons. Brass was a more expensive material, but as the Industrial Revolution started to pick up, it became more and more common. Officers generally had better quality material for the whole of their uniforms, so this one having brass buttons is pretty standard. Brass buttons were also easy to produce and easy to polish, so they became more popular amongst officers as the years went by. It is missing the shoulder boards or epaulets, but we will see them on a later piece to give you an idea of what they would look like. This badge on the collar here is a grenade, which is a standard symbol of Fusilier units, and it calls back to the original role of Fusiliers, which was to escort artillery. While the backs of these uniforms aren't as intricate as some of the Halifax rifles, they do have this detailing on the skirt. According to dress regulations, tunics had the skirt closed behind, edged with white cloth on a closing seam, with a 3-pointed slash at each side, a button at each point. The trousers are a dark blue with the broad red stripe down the side. Overall, a fairly common pair of trousers for the time period as well as regulation. You can see the buttons on the front and along the waist, which were used to button on suspenders. You can also see the buttons going down the fly. The leather bits at the bottom of the pant leg were instep straps, which would go around the bottom of your foot. These trousers would be very secure on whoever wore them. This tunic is also from before 1903, as it has a cuff lacing for the rank of major. You can see here this little extra looping on top of the chevron is what denotes the higher rank. You can also see how this looping is also prominent on the tunic's collar. And much like the last tunic, this piece is also missing its shoulder boards. Unlike the previous piece, this one has pewter buttons. Pewter was an inexpensive material and is a very soft metal, so much so that the shank on the back of pewter buttons could not be pewter themselves, as they wore out from the contact with thread. Many families could make pewter buttons in their own home, and poorer families did quite often. While it was a cheaper material, it was readily accessible. It does not explain why pewter buttons are on this tunic. Unfortunately, we can only guess as to why. It may have come down to preference. This one here is also an officer's tunic from 1906. It's a good example of how the cuff lacing was later simplified. As you can see here, it is one chevron pointed up with the Austrian knot on top, which would have been a lieutenant's cuff lace before the simplification. This one still has the epaulets attached, and you can see here the rank stars on top. You can also see the small regimental button on top of the shoulder board, something that was required in 1907 dress regulations. Shoulder boards were meant to be made of twisted round gold cords in a universal pattern, lined with scarlet and the aforementioned button on top. This is something adopted from the British Army, who still uses these today, as do Canadian Armed Forces. This one also has some extra pieces, like this belt and sash. The uniform regulations describe the sash as being crimson silk net backed with leather, without plates, with 2 3/4 inches, fastened with a 4-bar buckle fitted with horizontal overlapping loops. To be worn around the waist, the tassels over the left hip to hang 4 inches below the tunic. You can see the symbol of the PLF right here on the clasp of the belt. It has undergone some changes. The current symbol is a grenade with 19 points of fire with a crown in the center to symbolize Princess Louise. We don't have a tunic for World War I for the Princess Louise Fusiliers. However, during the First World War, the khaki tunic like this one we showed earlier in the video became standard for all units of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, though once again, officers' tunics would have been higher quality. The buttons and badges on the tunic, namely on the collar and epaulets, would denote regiment and rank. These would be the badges that would have been on a 66 Princess Louise Fusiliers non-commissioned officer's tunic. Thanks for watching!
If you're around Halifax this summer, be sure to come check out the Army Museum Halifax Citadel, open from May to October 31st daily from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m.
Located on the second floor of the Cavalier Building within the Halifax Citadel National Historic Site.